Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Vinay. I lead investor partnerships for EMEA at Traction. Welcome to another episode of my interview series with VCs based in the UK, the Sourcing Stack. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sam Gray, managing partner at Apposite Capital, one of Europe's leading specialist healthcare investors focused on scaling high-growth healthcare and life sciences businesses. Sam has spent nearly 2 decades at Apposite and has led investments across pharmaceuticals, medical technology, digital health, diagnostics, and healthcare services, giving him a uniquely broad perspective on how healthcare innovation is evolving globally. Prior to Apposite, he worked at Deutsche Bank, advising on complex transactions, and later at UCB, where he worked on strategic licensing and M&A, including the company's multi-billion-pound acquisition of Celtech. More recently, Apposite announced the launch of Apposite Healthcare Growth 1, backed by a landmark 100 million commitment from the British Business Bank, aimed at addressing one of the UK healthcare ecosystem's biggest challenges, the scale-up funding gap for healthcare technology and life sciences companies. Sam, it's great to have you on the Sourcing Stack.
Hi, well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited to share a bit more about Apposite and our new growth strategy. And for those that don't know, Apposite is a specialist healthcare and life sciences investor, investing across Europe. And we're now operating both a small buyout strategy as well as this new growth strategy. But common across both themes is our objective to invest in businesses that deliver better healthcare for more people. So impact is very fundamental to what we do also across our strategies.
Great. Now, to start with, the evolution of healthcare investing. You've invested across almost every layer of healthcare value chain, from medtech and diagnostics to the healthcare services and digital health. What originally drew you into healthcare investing specifically?
Yeah, well, I studied science at university, and I really got a terrific appreciation of how science and technology translates into economic growth and the development of society. Unfortunately, my experiments in my master's degree in chemistry never really worked, and I had to find an alternative outlet for my interest in science and technology. And that led me into financial services, initially with Deutsche Bank, working with large European pharmaceutical companies. But I do think it's that ability to work adjacent to science that is really stimulating. But also in healthcare, you're working in a field that is profoundly impactful to people in society, to people we're all affected by health, and so it's really a privilege to be able to work in that area, and immensely intellectually stimulating as well. Not only do you have the science, you also have politics, regulations, ethics, all impacting on what you do.
Right. A great journey, I must say. Healthcare is often seen as one of the most complex sectors for venture and growth investing. What makes it attractive despite the regulatory, reimbursement, and operational complexity?
Yeah, well, that complexity is very real. Regulation, reimbursement, clinical evidence, navigating large procurement processes with national procurement organizations. These are very difficult things for small companies to achieve. But if you can achieve them, that creates a competitive moat that prevents others replicating what you've done, and allows you to create a USP and a business that has a long-term future. So I think if you can understand, underwrite, and help businesses through these complexities, that is fundamentally the role of a specialist healthcare investor, and is both a risk and an opportunity. I think the other thing to say is that healthcare is always going to be a fundamentally hugely attractive sector, given well discussed demographic pressures in many countries. And I think those demographic pressures in the West are now getting to the point where it's really impacting on the ability of society to sustain the healthcare system in its current form. And so innovation and technology is becoming more and more important to help bend the cost curve and allow us to have the sort of healthcare that we want to have.
Great. Very good insights on on how this ecosystem or the complexity, how this can be mitigated. Now, you've spent nearly 2 decades at Apposite. How has healthcare investing fundamentally changed since you first entered the market?
Yes, well, I think certainly from a private equity perspective, rather than necessarily a venture perspective, it's transformed radically. When I first started, people talked about healthcare investment, and they meant nursing homes, nurseries, and funeral homes. They were really focused on those businesses that had very steady and predictable cash flows. But over the last 20 years, firms like Apposite have developed that are truly specialists, that understand the various complexities that we discussed earlier. And that's allowed the private equity sector to underwrite much more complicated risks in areas such as pharma, medical devices, life sciences tools. And so the sector has got a lot more sophisticated, both in terms of the specialist groups like Apposite, but also in terms of specialist expertise in the larger platforms. So I think that will continue. The US is still very, very much more developed in that way. And I think both private equity GPs, but also the underlying LPs are more sophisticated and understanding of specialist sector expertise in the US. But that's a trajectory that Europe is on also. But I think there is a particular gap at the sort of growth capital stage, where in the US that's a commonplace strategy, well understood by GPs and LPs, but in Europe that's still very nascent. And I think that probably is why we think there's a huge opportunity for Apposite Growth One that we're currently launching.
Excellent. It's a fascinating shift because it really shows how healthcare investing has evolved from being viewed primarily as a defensive, cash flow-oriented sector into one increasingly driven by technology, innovation, and scalable growth opportunities. Thank you. Now, as you mentioned, that there's a scale-up gap. So, firstly, congratulations on launching Apposite Healthcare Growth One alongside the British Business Bank. What convinced you there was a major funding gap emerging specifically at the healthcare scale-up stage?
So I think we saw it every day in our deal flow. When Apposite first started 20 years ago, we had a much more loose mandate, I guess, to invest across different sorts of deal structures and different stages. So we actually used to do more growth style investments. And over the years, as the industry and Apposite has matured, we've had to focus more on our small buyout strategy. But this left so many opportunities on the table that we saw in our deal flow, and that we knew were very exciting and interesting businesses, but they weren't ready for a buyout. They were looking for primary growth capital to scale further. And we were often asked, well, if you can't invest in this business, who should we talk to? And the number of names in Europe who invest in that profile of company is extremely limited. So this obviously creates a big opportunity. And so we started talking to investors, including the British Business Bank, about 2 years ago about how this was an opportunity, and how it was synergistic with our other activities as well in terms of origination and in terms of deal flow. And we found in those conversations that we weren't the only ones who recognized this gap in scale-up capital. There's been quite a lot of academic research published on that. And certainly the British Business Bank identified that as a very real need in the market, which is why they have given us 100 million in our first close to address this very aspect of the market.
Oh, great. That's a powerful validation, not just of the opportunity, but also how much market itself has evolved. When started as observing the gap directly through years of deal flow, eventually became institutional recognition that the UK genuinely needs more dedicated scale-up capital for healthcare innovation. Very interesting perspective. Now, Apposite is collaborating with the National Institute for Health and Care Research through this initiative. Why is deeper collaboration between capital providers and research ecosystems becoming increasingly important?
Yes, this is again something I've had a perspective on for a number of years, because I've been involved in some of the grants and the panels that the NIHR run, which give grant funding to early stage companies to develop their products and take them through clinical trials and regulatory approvals. And again, I've observed that whilst there is increasingly more capital available at that earlier stage from grants and from early stage investors, one of the deterrents for those early stage investors is that question over further follow-on funding for commercial expansion. I mean, you don't want to take the very high risks at the early stage on the technology, on the regulatory, on the reimbursement, unless you know that you can then scale a business to sufficient size to justify those risks. And therefore that sort of gap in the scale-up funding is important at the earlier stage. And I think funders of research such as the NIHR also recognize that, and are increasingly looking at how they can support their early stage companies through the whole journey, and not just at the very beginning, which will mean partnering with funders like Apposite Growth One, and being able to sort of signpost, mentor, and direct their companies in a way that underwrites the whole capital journey, not just the early beginnings of it.
Great. That's a really interesting evolution, because historically a lot of these worlds operated quietly, quite separately. Research institutions focused on innovation, while investors focused on commercialization much later in their journey. Now, speaking about building healthcare companies in 2026, looking at the healthcare innovation today, which areas excite you the most over the next decade? Digital health, AI-enabled diagnostics, life sciences tools, pharma services, or something else entirely?
Yeah, I guess I look at it slightly differently. I think one of the things we try to do at Apposite is move beyond those traditional silos of subsectors and look more at the sort of the impact that a certain technology or company can have, or another way of looking at it, how does it translate in the real world? And some of those real world themes are things like moving patients out of hospitals and into home care or community settings. And that is so important, because we can't afford those very large hospitals, and patients want to be at home, and people have chronic diseases now rather than acute episodes. So the hospital model doesn't work. So any technologies that support that trend are interesting, and that may be around wearables and monitoring, and AI may play a very big part in monitoring sort of vital signs and providing patient with support in their home or in the community. But it may also be around sort of miniaturizing technologies or making things more accessible in the community. And anything that addresses that theme, be it a device, a digital health concept, is going to be something that we're going to want to look at. In another way, I think personalization of treatments is personalized medicine is going to be a huge theme over the next 10 years. It's incredibly exciting. The advances that we've made in terms of genomics, in terms of imaging, in terms of being able to create personalized treatments for individuals that are much more effective than the older one style fits all models. And so we'll look, again, at across different technologies and different solutions for things that support that trend. So I think there's just huge opportunity, lots of different technologies, And I think, whilst the world is very focused on AI, and that's going to be massive in healthcare, there's also a lot of advances in the life sciences that are going to change the paradigms of how we treat health.
Great. What I understood is the shift towards more decentralized care models is something that is going to be the future of healthcare. Great. Now, AI is becoming embedded across healthcare workflows. Where do you think AI creates genuine long-term value versus where the market may currently be overhyping the opportunity?
Yes, well, AI is certainly a buzzword, and it is ubiquitous in every pitch deck that we might see. And I think that reflects that it does have the genuine potential to transform healthcare. But I think we're still in the early days of discovering how that is going to play out. I mean, our lens at Apposite is very much practical. AI is only really useful if it is creating durable value tied to workflow change, if it's validated, if it can change how things are done in a system and providing economic benefit. We see a lot of point solutions that are very clever and solve a problem, but the healthcare system isn't going to be able to adopt an almost infinite number of point solutions, can't afford it, and it can't deal with the complexity. So you need full enterprise solutions. You need the AI to be embedded in existing workflows or better workflows. And we're really looking for examples where that has been proven when we're looking at investing in scaling up solutions.
Great. That's a very grounded perspective, because right now AI appears almost every in every healthcare pitch deck. But the real question is whether it becomes a future or truly transforms how healthcare organizations operate at scale. Great insight. Moving on to the next question. Many healthcare founders underestimate how difficult commercialization can be. What are the most common mistakes you see companies make as they try to scale?
Yeah, this is a good question, because I think in contrast to perhaps biotechnology investment where you fund a clinical trial and then there's a value inflection point, the funding is much more nuanced in a growth stage company, and you make many more decisions about when to put the foot on the gas and put in a lot of funding or when not to. And I think that judgment is key. And you see examples of companies spending far too much money too soon before they've really validated their go-to-market approach and the repeatability of their sale. And you also see companies that underinvest once they have achieved that, and therefore don't reach their potential. And it's those judgments, I think, that are the most difficult thing in this scenario, and where you really do want an investor on board who's been through these sorts of journeys, made these decisions. And another thing that we like to do at Apposite is bring onto boards operating partners who have themselves been CEOs or senior members of teams that have successfully navigated these sorts of decisions. So I think that judgment about when to go for it and when to hold back is the key challenge. And part of getting that right is looking at the business holistically, rather than sort of just looking at we've got to get reimbursement, or we've got to get regulatory approval, we've got to do this clinical trial. You need to look beyond that and then how do we use that to achieve the proof points that we need to commercially scale this, and at what point will a customer truly believe that we've achieved those proof points and buy. And that's the point when you can put more into commercialization.
Great. It's a very good insight for all the founders or the CXOs of a healthcare company. Great insights. Now, let's talk about the healthcare market dynamics. Private healthcare demand in the UK has accelerated significantly in recent years. Do you think there is this is a temporary post-pandemic effect, or we are witnessing a structural reshaping of how or how healthcare is delivered?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things going on here at the same time. First of all, demand for healthcare is sort of a bit like a balloon. If you squeeze it in one place, it'll pop up in another. At the moment in the UK, the NHS budgets are constrained, their resources are constrained by staffing, and that is leading to faster growth in alternative forms of healthcare, such as private self-pay, corporate wellness, occupational health models of care. And given the constraints on government finances at the current time, this is perhaps unlikely to change radically anytime soon. Although obviously government policy can change and funding rounds will change things from government to government. But I think more structurally, the expectations of particularly younger generations on how healthcare should be consumed is very, very different from earlier generations. People are now expecting things to be delivered on demand in a consumer-friendly format via digital access. And you're starting to see this being met by a cohort of digital savvy and efficient service providers offering services of different types, often around wellness and sort of biohacking, in addition to traditional sort of private healthcare models. So I do think this is a trend that will continue, and certainly a trend where the UK perhaps lags other countries where there's been a longer, for a longer time, there has been a consumer market for healthcare.
Great. That balloon effect analogy is really compelling because it captures how healthcare demand doesn't disappear. It simply shifts when public systems become constrained.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Now, healthcare systems globally are under enormous pressure from aging populations, workforce shortages, as you just mentioned, for at least by the governments, and rising costs. Which technologies or business models do you believe will have the biggest impact in addressing those pressures?
Yeah, so this is a real concern globally. How do we afford the healthcare that we all expect to have in a world of aging populations and shrinking government budgets? And the answer to that is technology. And we touched on this earlier. Technologies that can expand the capacity of the healthcare system by shifting care into the home or into the community, or reducing staffing or hospital infrastructure, is going to be key here. In theory, the other big lever that would reduce the cost of healthcare is prevention and sort of wellness, and that's always been an area that's been really underinvested both by private and public funders, because it's really difficult to generate a return on investment in that area. We may be starting to see that change. I think the GLP-1s, they're primarily being taken as a way of losing weight, but actually they may also prevent lots of downstream diseases of diabetes and other diseases that collectively are a huge cost on the healthcare system, so that they may actually turn out to be a form of prevention that with a good return on investment. And there's a huge number of ancillary services and support functions that need to go alongside the actual drugs themselves. And I think in other areas of healthcare, cancer being one, maybe in diseases like Alzheimer's being another, that there are going to be these sort of transformational therapies that may change how the diseases progress, but will need infrastructure and support to deliver them to the population.
Great insights, Sam. Are we entering a new cycle of healthcare M&A and consolidation, particularly across fragmented provider markets and specialist healthcare services?
I think there is a trend for consolidation, and that is driven by the increasing sophistication of the technology requirements that are needed to meet regulatory requirements and to operate efficiently. We have a large care group in the UK called Swanton Care, and we have built that up through a number of acquisitions of sort of owner-managed businesses, smaller businesses, and those businesses just didn't have the wherewithal to be able to invest in modern technology and keep up with regulations in some cases. So what we've been able to do with a much larger group is invest in a platform technology that enables the whole group to be paperless, and then we can monitor sort of individual quality levels and staffing levels at the different sites, centrally, have much better visibility, and be able to actually provide families and funders with really detailed information on outcomes and care, and that's the future, really. So I think trends like that drive consolidation, and will continue to do so.
Great. Coming to the founder advice and looking ahead, if a healthcare founder approached you tomorrow raising growth capital, what would make you immediately lean in?
So I think what we really want to see for a growth round is proof of a repeatable revenue model. The more the entrepreneur can identify that they understand the sales cycle, why customers buy, what the right pricing is, and how to generate repeatable sales, I think the more it lends itself to growth capital. And I think sometimes early stage companies don't spend enough time on that, testing that and proving that. But if you can identify the sort of formula for a repeatable sale, then you can very comfortably put more capital into expanding the sales force and other scale up initiatives. So that's probably key.
Great. Healthcare innovation often requires patience, resilience, and long development timelines. What advice would you give founders navigating their journey today?
Yeah, it is obviously a marathon and not a sprint. And I think both the funders and the entrepreneurs in the sector have to be comfortable with that, which is why it can be beneficial to work with specialist healthcare investors who've seen that before. I think my biggest piece of advice would be to sort of work backwards from where you want to be, perhaps in 5 years' time at an exit, and really map out the steps, the milestones, the sequences, the financing that will be required to get there. And it can be very difficult as an early stage entrepreneur to be thinking that far ahead. You're thinking about how you make payroll next month, not how you achieve a certain profile in 5 years' time. But I think unless you do that, you risk sort of doing things in the wrong order or misprioritizing things and not getting the full package of milestones and objectives in place that you're going to need to raise those subsequent funding rounds. So I do encourage people to think backwards, work out where you want to get to, and the steps you're going to have to take to get there.
Great. Sam, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. We covered everything from the evolution of healthcare investing and UK's healthcare scale-up gap to the realities of commercialization, the role of AI shifting patient expectations, and broader structural pressures reshaping global healthcare systems. What stood out throughout the discussion is that the future of healthcare will not be driven by technology alone, but by the ability to translate innovation into scalable, real-world impact. Thank you again for joining us on the Sourcing Stack and sharing such thoughtful perspectives where healthcare innovation and investing are headed next. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.